So this talk is about how papers dealing with experiments on Einstein's relativity get messed up. And this is my information source. It's a book by Stanley Goldberg. So Goldberg says the following: it might be thought that one problem in assessing the assimilation of relativity by American scientists during the 60 years between 1920 and 1980 is that there has been an enormous growth in the size of the American physics group. There are many more physicists who are doing research and publishing more papers in more journals. Keeping track of it all, as well as assessing how the theory of relativity is interpreted, seems impossible, but a case can be made that the primary literature in physics is not the appropriate data bank to use to assess the assimilation of relativity in the United States. A much better source is the physics textbook literature. So my comments on that: relativity textbooks can be a better source of information on some things than science papers. And one of those issues is sort of the assimilation of special relativity. That's better dealt with in the textbooks. And also another issue better dealt with in the textbooks is how the theory of relativity is to be interpreted. Note, this is what I've noticed, is since World War II, because America seems seen as the forefront of physics, with its atom bomb that's influenced the science physics to be done in the American way across the whole sort of world. Goldberg gives two reasons for this. There are at least two reasons for this, he says. First, the format and content of published papers in physics is standardized to transmit the results of research in the most efficient manner. Earlier editors of journals might have insisted on discursive inquiries into the interpretation of the formal systems used in the analysis of theoretical and experimental results. That is no longer the case. So what's being said there is since the Americans have taken over doing science or stroke physics in their way, the way journals are written is now being changed. There's not going to be so much discussion of theoretical interpretations in papers that are publishing experimental results. Goldberg carries on: there is a widely accepted pattern of reporting which suppresses such excursions. Very little of the primary research literature concentrated on the theory of relativity. Rather, the formal aspects of the theory were used for other purposes, for example, to predict the mass of subatomic particles or the expected half-life in experiments in nuclear physics, when the particles have a very high speed relative to the laboratory frame of reference. But using the equation of the theory of relativity says little about the terms under which the theory was understood, since the same formalism might represent commitment to a totally different theory. So once again, pointing out interpretation is being ignored in these scientific papers. Goldberg carries on: textbook accounts of the theory of relativity are much more useful for examining the way the special theory of relativity was assimilated by American scientists. In the 19th century, the distinguishing mark of American education was the textbook. in Europeans called the use of textbooks the American system. It has been argued by Kern that when new ideas are introduced in science, not only are there few converts, but it takes long periods for the new point of view to take hold. According to him, after the transition from the old theory to the new, it is the role of scientific textbooks to transmit the new standards about the class of physical problems. So what you're talking about is a change in theory which the textbooks are trying to impose on you. And this is the relevant book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which has an influence on how physics and the rest of science is interpreted. And this is the relevant philosopher. He's an American historian and philosopher of science, and whose book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, was influential in both academic and popular circles. And this is how he thinks of science, scientific progress. If you start from the top, if you have a scientific revolution, that leads to a paradigm, that leads to normal science. Following that paradigm, where you then, if you've got problems with anomalies, then you're still trying to interpret it according to that paradigm. And if you can't keep it within that paradigm, then you have a major change which takes place, which is a scientific revolution. So according to him, you have normal science, and if you can't keep within that particular paradigm, you then have to go to have a scientific revolution. So he looks upon Einstein's physics as being a scientific revolution away from what was classical physics before, and then you're trying to fit everything into the paradigm of Einstein. And if you can't fit it into that, then you have a revolution. So how relativity develops is now interpreted by that. So going back to the point made by Goldberg earlier, he says the format and content of published papers in physics is standardized to transmit the results of research in the most efficient manner. Earlier editors of journals might have insisted on discursive inquiries into interpretation of formal systems used in the analysis of theoretical and experimental results. That is no longer the case, and that is what has happened in the scientific journals since the Americans have sort of taken the lead in physics. And by suppress such excursions means not allowing so much to be said in science papers dealing with experiments on relativity to go into too much explanation as to what the results of the experiments means in terms of the theory. And such excursions would have led to how do you interpret relativity? Would you interpret it by Lorentz theory, or would you interpret by what Einstein was saying? Such discussions of how to interpret the theory are being omitted from the papers dealing with the experiments on relativity. And that sort of way of doing things must still be happening today, after Goldberg has pointed them out. Papers dealing with relativity experiments are not giving sufficient information to what their experimental results means in terms of interpretation of relativity theory. It's mostly omitted from those papers. what the experimental results mean for interpretation in relativity theory is left out of the papers and left for those reading the papers, such as theorists, to make up their own interpretations. And Goldbergs note in the primary source for how relativity is interpreted is now being the textbooks for students. Goldberg goes on and says it might be thought that explanations of the theory of relativity in textbooks might be misleading because, regardless of the author's convictions about the meaning, that's the author of the textbook, his or her convictions would give way to pedagogical expediency. But textbooks proved to be one of the few places where physicists are willing to discuss it, if only implicitly, the meaning of theories and their concepts of how evidence supports theories. That makes textbooks a useful resource to judge how the theory of relativity is assimilated by scientists. Physics textbooks help established physicists indoctrinate future scientists in the meaning of the discipline. Note the word, and my comment on that is note the word indoctrinate. Goldberg is willing to admit that the physics education system is an indoctrination program, i.e. brainwashing. And also textbooks are a place where physicists are willing to discuss what the theories mean and how evidence supports theories, something that can get from the textbooks, which is usually omitted from peer-reviewed science papers. So that's how the papers on relativity experiments get messed up. They are not going into sufficient detail about what the experimental results has in terms of the various different interpretations of relativity theory. Just going to omit details about that and going to leave the interpretation to textbooks. Thank you. That's the end of this talk.